So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let's see. Is everybody seeing that okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And you're seeing the screen not with all the extra slides across the bottom, right?
I do see others.
Yeah, we see all the extra as
We can
well.
see all that. Okay, let me try this. Is that better?
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
yep.
Okay, great. So I'm Tanya La Mar. I am a PhD candidate at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. I'm here to speak with you today about a paper that I wrote with my advisor, Joe Buller, about supporting students with special needs. Some of you may have read it. It's called Valuing Difference and Growth. But if you haven't, no problem. I'm going to be sort of giving an overview of what we spoke about in that paper and some recommendations for how we can be supporting students with special needs, especially in mathematics. So that's me there. And then over on the left is my advisor, Joe, who you might be familiar with. Oops. Okay. So for those of you that maybe aren't familiar with Youcubed, to just give you a quick little snippet about what Youcubed does. It's a center at Stanford that is focused on sharing ideas from neuroscience and translating that research into lessons, videos, news for parents and for teachers to just sort of try to bring math into the 21st century and really meld together what we know from research with practice. Youcubed is all about sharing free resources with teachers and showing students about the beauty and creativity in math, because we often don't see that and get a very narrow view about what math is. The website's had 51 million visits in the last 5 years. There's hundreds of free tasks and lessons. Our curriculums or tasks have been used in 2/3 of US schools. And our newsletters opened in over 160 countries. So we definitely have widespread, I guess, influence is what we're hoping in classrooms, not just in the US, but across the whole world. So just a little bit about me. I'm a first-generation college student and I majored in math, but I didn't really see myself as a math person. I actually started out as a business major and did all of the prereq math courses for that major and realized I really loved math. I was just scared that I wasn't good enough to do it. But with some encouragement from some professors, I went ahead and did it. And it was the first time that I saw math as being about logic and reasoning and really that when I could put my mind into understanding why things worked, that this whole other version of mathematics opened up for me about making connections across ideas and really being able to think through what does it mean to prove something. And it was really empowering for me and my identity because, like I said, I didn't really see myself as a smart person. I didn't really see myself as a math person. And so being able to find success in that space, especially as a first-generation college student, was really transformational for me. At that same time, I started working with other students, primarily other students of color or students from low-income backgrounds that were in our pre-baccalaureate program. And I was frustrated to see that students had been, told they were college ready. They had gone through and done all of the requirements to graduate high school and be college ready, but they were still being put in coursework that was pre-baccalaureate. So it wasn't counting towards their degree. And I felt like the version of mathematics that they were working with was that kind of disempowered version that I kind of had broken out from, and I'd seen this other version of math. And so I became very passionate about trying to share this other version with people, especially students that maybe feel like they're not math people. From there, I came to Stanford actually to get my teaching credential, my master's, and then I went to teach in LA Unified. During my time in LA Unified, the school I was at had a full inclusion model for special education, meaning all students with IEPs were taught in the mainstream classrooms for core, actually for all classes. So that meant that I co-taught with a special education teacher so that all students were receiving the same the same curriculum. They weren't being placed in an outside classroom where maybe the expectations might be lowered, or they're not getting as rigorous of mathematics as they could be getting. So we had that full inclusion model, which I can speak to a little bit more later if you have questions. But I found myself even in my teaching practice, pushing back against these damaging beliefs about what it means to do math, that, you know, I had students still coming in and wanting me to tell them everything, to want to be able to just follow a procedure. And as I could tell from experience, that's not a very empowering experience of math. And it's also not what math looks like in the real world. So I felt like I was really working against these closed beliefs about math. And then the ways that was kind of pigeonholing students into math people and not math people. So from there, I decided I would really like to come and get a PhD and potentially eventually work in teacher education and research. And what's become really compelling to me is looking at research and understanding the neuroscience in terms of how our brains work and grow and rewire almost constantly. And sort of that information doesn't seem well known, especially in education. In being trained as a researcher, I am seeing how damaging labels really can be. Of course, in some cases, labels are helpful because they give students, you know, the certain supports that they need or funding. But a lot of times I'm seeing that labels are really limiting what students believe they're capable of or what others expect from that student because they have a particular label. I'm also seeing in research that a lot of the benchmarks we use to decide if a student has it or not are arbitrary. They're, you know, just because a student didn't understand multiplication at a certain month in their life doesn't mean that they're not capable of learning that and mastering that content. So these arbitrary measures are pigeonholing students into spaces where we're believing that they aren't math people or that they aren't going to be successful in mathematics, and that's not true. And it's, I think, pretty concerning. So what I'm going to kind of go through here today is the myth of a math person and how that's tied into math anxiety. And then also moving into the power of neuroplasticity and the hope that we have in that space. So in terms of the myth of a math person, I know a lot of us maybe like, and you know, an offhand comment could say like, oh, I'm not a math person. And it's not uncommon to say that. Students believe that it's true. Teachers believe that it's true. Oftentimes teachers, you know, are looking to find who are the math people and the not math people to recommend students for certain classes. And a lot of our school structures are based around this idea that there's such thing as a math person. So we used to think that it was like this, that right when you were born, your abilities in mathematics were fixed, that you had a math brain or you didn't. But neuroscience research shows us that this is not how it works. It's not true. Our brains actually never become fixed completely, that it's malleable, not just in childhood, but all the way through adulthood. The way that our brains work when we're learning something is that we have neurons in our brain, and a synapse fires when you're learning and thinking about new things. And those synapses can create a new pathway. When we are able to connect ideas, we are connecting to neurons and a pathway connects there. And the more that we're able to make connections across that idea, the more that that pathway strengthens. And this idea of neurons and pathways growing and changing, it's happening all the time, and it doesn't stop happening because you hit a certain age. So our brains are constantly doing this. So an interesting study that kind of shows us the ability for our brain to grow and change based on what you need your brain to do for you is this study done with cab drivers in London. So they have to learn 25,000 streets and 20,000 landmarks to become certified as a cab driver because they're not reliant on smartphones like we all are now. So neuroscientists studied their brains and they found that, They found that they had a larger hippocampus at the end of their training period. So the part of their brain that is dedicated towards memorizing that map of the city and being able to decide, if I want to go here, how am I going to get there? So through that training, this section of their brain actually became enlarged. And then once the cab drivers retired, it shrinks back down. So once you're not using that part of your brain anymore, your brain is very economical with space and actually starts using that space for something else. So it shrunk back down, and now your brain would be more focused on a different space. So here's an interesting story about a young boy named Nicholaslechford. In first grade, his parents were told that he was learning disabled and had a very low IQ, and actually that he was the worst child the teachers had seen in 20 years. But in 2018, he graduated with a doctorate in applied mathematics from Oxford University. And his story is told in a book that I'm going to recommend at the end of this presentation called Reversed by Lois Letchford, which is, she's Nicholas's mother. She details what it was like to have a child that was labeled in this way and the ways that she advocated for him throughout his education. So it's a very powerful example of just because a certain label was given to your child doesn't necessarily mean that they can't achieve at high levels through a less narrow approach. So here's an example of what I mean about this narrow approach. Many schools emphasize a narrow way of thinking, which causes students who think differently to turn away from math and even sometimes become labeled as having a disability. But there's no agreed upon assessment criterion for giving a child a math learning disability diagnosis. And so oftentimes low math achievement is used as an indicator. Another example is sometimes we use lack of speed or accuracy as an indicator, but there's no reason that when students are learning math facts that we need to do it in this way of memorizing math facts under a minute, because we know that this is causing further damage, especially in terms of introducing what's called math anxiety. So the purpose of these two images here are, there's two ways that you can go about teaching students math facts and the recall of them. One is this flexible way of thinking about I'm giving multiplication as an example, but you can think about it flexibly, you can think about it visually, you can think about it in multiple ways of what is 5 times 6, what does that mean? And students can become more and more comfortable with that versus what we typically see in classrooms, which is a very stressful 1-minute event of the multiplication facts time tests, which we know a lot of people's math anxiety stems from those kinds of tests. So I was going to use a spider on this page, but I didn't because I couldn't handle looking at the pictures of them. But we know that math anxiety triggers the fear center in your brain. It's the same fear center that lights up when you see snakes and spiders. What's interesting about math anxiety is actually can be passed from teachers to students and from parents to students. So one study showed that parents' math anxiety predicted their child's math achievement in school. And this was regardless of the parent's own math knowledge. It had nothing to do with that. It was just their math anxiety being transferred to their child and being predicted in their child's achievement. And this was especially true for parents that helped their children with homework. Another example is this Baylock study. It followed a number of math teachers, elementary female math teachers, and found that the teacher's math anxiety predicted the female students' achievement, but not the males. And we attribute this to female students often identifying with their same gender teachers. But both of these are just showing examples of math anxiety is easily transferable to children. And so it's very important that when we're talking about mathematics with kids, that we are being careful of not saying things like, I'm not a math person, I was never good at this, but instead finding ways to engage with the math that's creative, being curious. It's okay to show kids when you don't understand something because that's modeling what learning actually entails. Here's another example of what it would look like to engage with a visual version of mathematics, or this flexible thinking. So these are 5 different ways to be thinking about what is 18 times 5. There are different visual ways, rather flexible, for example, of taking, instead of 18 times 5, thinking of it as 20 times 5, and then taking away the extra 10, and so on. So we don't need to be teaching students to just strictly memorize, because we know that for brain growth and for brain efficiency, that when students have multiple versions of how they understand a topic, they're actually better able to recall that fact because they have strong pathways in their brain. So all of this is to move into looking at the power of neuroplasticity. We've got one example of a study here that was conducted at Stanford. This was conducted with students that were designated with a math learning disability and a neurotypical comparison group. And the researchers collected MRI scans while the students worked on math. The students that had that were designated with MLD had more brain regions lighting up when they worked on a math problem, which might at first seem like, oh, good. But the issue is we don't want your brain to be lighting up all across many spaces, but a couple very focused spaces. So this widespread lighting up of the brain while working on mathematics is sort of an indicator of inefficiency. So these students underwent an 8-week-long one-on-one tutoring program. And in the post, both sets of students had the same achievement, and the post MRI scans showed that the students with math learning disabilities showed the exact same brain areas lighting up. So again, this is showing the power of neuroplasticity and knowing that just because a student is struggling with seeing math in one way doesn't mean that we can't strengthen those pathways and allow the student to still find success, to still train their brain to get to the space it needs to get to. A diagnosis doesn't need to be, okay, that's it, you're not a math person, you're not going to get there. There's a lot of ways that we can go about training our brains to work in the ways that we expect. So one point that I really wanted to make about this paper is that it's not giving the argument that all students have the same potential, or that some students don't have learning disabilities that need special attention. That is definitely true. But we are claiming that students develop these incorrect ideas about math and then believe that they can't be successful in math, especially when it's taught in this narrow, enclosed way. So my recommendations are, first, to be mindful of labels and to avoid inappropriate limits that we could put on student potential with those labels. Like I said in the beginning, sometimes labels are helpful. Sometimes they allow our student to get certain supports that they need or certain funding for the school for our child. But when a label becomes something that limits students' belief about their potential or limits the way that other adults treat that child, that's where we want to be really careful about where labels are used and how they're used. My second recommendation is for teachers to provide mathematical tasks that are open and multidimensional. So when we've done studies at Youcubed where we're using these tasks that have multiple ways to be thinking about them, multiple directions that you can take the task, and what we call low floor, high ceiling, meaning there's a low barrier for entry into the task, but you can take it to very high levels of mathematics. And what we're hearing from teachers and from students is this is a much more empowering way to be engaging in math. There's not so much of a focus on having just one right answer. So students are a lot more comfortable sharing their ideas and hearing from one another. And it really is normalizing, what does it really look like when you learn math? Well, we struggle, we make mistakes, we learn from our mistakes, we think differently from one another. And that's a much more healthy version of mathematics and a better approximation of what mathematics looks like in the real world. And so we're hoping that we can be pushing schools and teachers to be teaching in this way. Related to that is just being thoughtful of how we react to students' struggle. Oftentimes struggle is seen as this thing that we need to actively avoid and hide when it happens. But really struggle is some of the times that's most productive for our brain. Our brain is actually growing when we're struggling. That feeling of like frustration you feel in your brain when you're trying to figure out something new is actually what it feels like for your brain to be growing. So the more that we can normalize struggle and embrace it rather than avoid it and hide it, the better. So here are some books that I like to recommend. First is one from my advisor, Joe Bowler, called Limitless Mind. The second one here, reversed, is the one from Nicholaslechford's mother, where she speaks about what it was like to have a child that was labeled in this way and how she supported him along the way. And then this third one is called The Woman Who Changed Her Brain by Barbara Arrowsmith Young. This woman started a school actually in Canada that uses many of the interventions, like in the neuroplasticity study of the students with math learning disabilities. She started a school that focuses on these kinds of interventions to support kids with learning disabilities. We have so her story herself is actually, she was labeled with a disability, and the ways that she found to train her brain to pull herself out from that. She still obviously has some struggles, but she's taken that method and been able to share it with students across the country and the United States, so Canada and the United States. So we have a free webinar on Youcubed that is with the Arrowsmith Young program, the Arrowsmith program, detailing more of that method for teaching. One other thing I wanted to share about is just the special education page on Youcubed. So I will share these slides. These are all linked, so you could just go right from these links. But the special education page is where you'll find that webinar. And then there's also the books, more than the ones that I've just highlighted for you. Those are just my favorites, but there's more books and also research articles. This is where you can also find the paper that this presentation was based on. And then one paper on that page that I want to direct you to is by Palo. And this is about how do we have effective IEP meetings, especially when we're designing the math goals for students. And he has this chart in that page that I think you might find useful for your next IEP meeting with your child. So I would definitely recommend checking out that paper. And then finally, we've got this paper called Fluency Without Fear. And that one really digs in on what are the different ways that we can be supporting students to develop fluency in math facts that isn't anxiety inducing. Knowing how damaging math anxiety can be, it's important that when it's time for students to be learning all of those facts, that we find creative ways, multidimensional ways for students to engage, so that we can still, create those pathways and get students to where they need to be, but without the stressors of you need to do this in 1 minute. So go ahead and you can check out that paper. It has more examples in it than the ones that I provided here. And then the Youcubed page outside of the special education tab also has additional resources that you could use with your children at home, or you could share with their teachers. So that is the end of my presentation portion. And I think now we can open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am going to go ahead and stop the recording.